This leads us nicely into our first session. I am privileged to introduce the first two presentations by Dr. Quanisha Charles and Dr. Olivia Nabukeera, who are here in the US. Their presentations are based on the theme of Blackness in English education. I now turn it over to Dr. Quanisha Charles.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Alrighty. And so my topic is on transnational Black feminism, enacting love as a practice of freedom, equity, and justice. As a global educator who works around many different cultures, have traveled and worked in many different countries, being a part of so many different nations, wearing my Blackness in so many different ways, inquisitive people wanting to know more about me and my culture. I thought it was most appropriate to adopt this particular lens and share how it can be helpful within English language teaching context. So I hope that you maybe can find it useful as well. And so I want to preface this presentation by saying that by quoting this hope from the late Bell Hooks. She says, the moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. And so I find myself consistently, when I'm thinking about my own pedagogy, when I'm thinking about who I am as an educator, as a teacher, as a leader, as a student even, what are some ways in which I can expand my love to others? And I view that as a practice of freedom. And so the objectives are to highlight ways in which transnational Black feminist guiding principles can be useful in English language teaching, introduce love as a method and practice of freedom for anti-racist education, discuss strategies that promote racial equity and racial justice within the language classroom. All right, and so this concept may be very new to many of you, so I am gonna give you some definitions and terms. As you can see, transnational Black feminism is a collective freedom movement beyond borders. Right? It's a movement that seeks equity and justice for disenfranchised groups, but especially for Black women. Racial equity is a process of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone, right? So this can be very challenging when we work in capitalist societies such as the US, where there's a need for someone to be in the upper class and someone to be in the lower class and someone to say, I have more than you, so that means I'm better than you. My English language skills are more proficient than yours, etc. Right? So that maintains the inequitable environment. It is the intentional and continual practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures by prioritizing measurable changes in the lives of people of color. Right? It is a vision. Racial justice is a vision and transformation of society to eliminate racial hierarchies and advance collective liberation. Right. So as opposed to, I'm up here, how can we work together? Or how can we maybe share these resources? If you have a strength, your asset is on something else, how can we exchange and share resources? So advanced collective liberation, where Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in particular have the dignity, resources, power, self-determination to fully thrive. And of course, we can extend racial justice for those who have physical and not so visible disabilities, things of that nature, LGBTQIA plus communities, etc. Anti-racist education is a theory of learning and action to help us do the important work of dismantling racism in schools. This is why within the US, it's very important that we have concepts and some type of survey to gauge what are the racial background of these students, to understand who is actually advancing, who is getting more access, how can we bring forth the change. So US Supreme Court's decision was very disheartening to many individuals, especially marginalized and historically marginalized groups, because we understand within places like the US, there are inequitable advances for certain racial groups, particularly white racial groups. And so we're trying to find ways to consistently understand how can we dismantle this so everyone can fully thrive. So it explicitly highlights, critiques, and challenges institutional racism. It addresses how racist beliefs and ideologies structure one-on-one interactions and personal relationships. It examines and challenges how institutions support and maintain disadvantages and advantages along racial lines. So the L.O.V.E. method. So any form of justice work encompasses love as an idea, but love also as a method. So when I was thinking about this, the L represents how am I going to lift up others, right? So as an educator, what does it mean by lifting up others? The O represents offering support. How can I extend and offer my support to others? Valuing others. How do I show value to others and for others? So even with my status as being a part of historically marginalized groups, I'm consistently looking for ways to utilize the very limited access to resources that I have to share with others. And how am I evolving as a person? What does that say about me? So within the paradigm of TESOL, a transformative vision of racial justice that employs transnational Black feminists requires doing away with hierarchies, right? So as opposed to having one group saying this group is at the top, how can we shift our resources? How can we share our power? How can we engage with our community? How can we maintain dignity and be transparent so that everyone can fully thrive? Anti-racist teaching involves teaching as a way of promoting transparency, love, and honesty. So if I'm not being truthful to you, if I'm not being transparent, to you, then that shows some type of lack of integrity on my part. And clearly I have no love for you, right? And so this is a very important guiding principle of transnational Black feminism, right? And oftentimes the truth hurts. Sometimes it makes us sad, sometimes it makes us cry, but it makes us evolve, right? Usually when we are uncomfortable, that's when we want to make a difference. That's when we want to do better. So the L.O.V.E. method embodies the work of TBF because it is rooted in a collaborative work of justice and collective freedom. It considers the affordances of others and forms of access. It acknowledges that everyone has different starting points, and it advocates for everyone to fully thrive, right? And we know that everyone has different starting points, whether you are born into a family of wealth, you are born into a family of poverty. You were born speaking English as your first language. You were born not knowing anything about English, right? You were born into a business-oriented family. You were born into a non-so-business-oriented family where everything is centered on community building, right? So we all have different affordances, but we all should view that as an asset as opposed to a deficit. And so these are the 4 guiding principles. So Kimberly Crenshaw is known for intersectionality, particularly within the US context. This idea within the legal system, but also within education, identifying overlapping layers of oppression and realities, especially among Black women. Scholar activism, engaging international politics by reframing domestic issues in the context of international, transnational, or global issues that decolonizes and transforms, right? So particularly with scholar activism, this is very important. So we saw this when we were in the height of the pandemic, and the death of George Floyd went global, seemingly. We were able to watch this on the news, on the media. We saw the implications of police injustice in so many different contexts. We were able to identify ways in which racism is played out in many different contexts. And many scholars around the world, as global educators, we wanted to find ways to transform what is happening in our local community and how can we make that more global. So we were using hashtags. We were on Twitter, we were on Facebook and other social media accounts to share what's happening and how we can bring forth change. So there was a sense of solidarity building, which is very important. It's one of the 4 guiding principles. It's sustained ongoing commitment around shared beliefs and goals. It's like a sisterhood. It is a sisterhood, right? And so this becomes quite tricky when we do not have shared beliefs and goals, right? So with transnational Black feminism, anti-racism is a key component to being a part of this movement, right? Because if you have no sense or no idea or no efforts in trying to dismantle racism, then we cannot ensure that you are aligned with the goals that we believe. You know, you're doing your best to maintain this particular hierarchy, right? And so this idea can always, often, and we encourage it to be further theorized, refuted, and so forth. Attention to borders and boundaries. Wherever two or more cultures edge each other, where people of different races occupy the same territory, where under, lower, middle, and upper classes touch, where the space between two individuals shrink with intimacy, right? So borders and boundaries can be defined in so many different ways. And we can see that what's going on in society with wars, with even within the US, red states, blue states, conservative, Republican, Democratic, these things, right? So usually wherever there are two or more cultures bordering one another, there's going to be a conflict, right? Who's who and what belongs to who, etc. So I am going to show you ways in which this is how I try to incorporate this particular lens into my classroom as an English language teaching professional. And I'm going to start with the first guiding principle, intersectionality. And what you're looking at is a bubble. And then the bubble has little tiny bubbles. So this is ways in which I represent myself, right? So the bigger bubble, I consider myself to be a Black Indigenous woman of color, right? So that's what you see when you first look at me, or maybe you just see a woman of color, and then you don't find out that maybe I'm a US citizen or an American until you talk to me. You won't know that maybe I identify as a native English speaker until you talk to me. You won't know that my religious background is a Christian until you talk to me, right? So these unseen things that you probably won't know until you talk to me, these are on the outside, and these are what I like to consider maybe some assets, right? Within TESOL, the paradigm of English language teaching, these are assets, and these are probably some of the identities that are most contended and contested within our field as well, right? So we all know the struggles of what that means when some implications of being a native English speaker and how that has impacted our field so much. Citizenry within the US, right? The implications of that, being a Christian. I like to consider this a privilege within the US, right? And so all of these values shape who I am and how I teach and what I consider to be most important. So focusing on love first, right? So the L, how am I lifting up others, right? So how am I using what I have to support others? And I do this, for example, by centering the voices and experiences of those who identify as non-native speakers, right? Because although I do identify as a native speaker, I'm often positioned as a non-native speaker because I do not identify as white, right? And even with that marginalization, I still try to find ways to lift up the voices of those who identify as non-native English speakers, right? So I'm consistently using my values to serve others, offering support, have students identify strengths and weaknesses, causes and effects, and inquire about ways to improve the situation. So I do this often in my writing classrooms. I ask students to identify some challenges or issues that are affecting their local community. And what are some ways in which we can bring forth change, right? So I can identify this through having students write a narrative. I can identify this through having students writing a cause and effect paper, right? And then, or even through research, right? Students interviewing someone within their local community, and then telling us what's going on and presenting their research with the class. And ultimately sharing this with a global audience or with a more broader audience. So for example, within my context, we have maybe multilingual forums where students can share their research and move on to publishing if they so choose to. So ask students to share names of famous scholars. These are some ways in which I tend to use my assets to value others. I ask students to share names of famous scholars, writers from their heritage, or who speak their heritage language, and incorporate it into the curriculum and assignment. So I do try to keep my classroom as student focused as possible. All right, so I provide students with the ideas or concepts, but everything the student is writing about is coming directly from their home context. I survey students to solicit feedback about class activities, and this helps me to evolve because I'm understanding and I'm assessing what is working for students, what's not working, and how can I improve. So how students felt about the assignment, what could be improved. An example would be the feel, felt, found technique. I'm not exactly sure if you have heard of that or not, but understanding what students are going through. I feel what you're going through. I understand this situation. I felt how that situation could have affected others. And here's what I found. And I share more resources with students, and it helps students to improve as well. So ways in which I also empower students. Guiding principle number 2, scholar activism. So how am I lifting up others? So engaging in international politics by reframing domestic issues in the context, and then making it more of a global issue, right? So we can see that maybe from privileging the written word, if it's not written down, then it doesn't exist, right? So that's a huge issue because many students come from oral cultures, right? So what are some ways in which we can use our assets to talk about some international issues and how we can bring forth change without maybe publishing, right? Not everyone is a strong publisher, right? So what are some ways we can be more visual in our approach? And this could comprise of maybe signs, picturesque signs, maybe even wearing some type of clothing, or showing ways in which we can bring awareness through flyers, through poetry night, things like that, to talk about matters that are going on and how we can support, GoFundMe accounts, things like that. Identify students' linguistic concerns and inquire about ways to improve the situation, right? And so I'm consistently thinking about ways in which I can identify what is some struggles for students. So within my current context, I teach at a private liberal arts university or college. And many students that I teach, they are coming from maybe a more affluent background, right? And so many of the students are strong writers. However, they do talk about maybe some challenges of getting acclimated within the US culture, right? And so it's more of, I'm a little bit shy, so how do I learn more about American culture, right? And so it's not necessarily the linguistic concerns that the students in my current context are so focused on. It's more of social concerns, right? But even then, within the writing class, I'm always looking for ways in which, or asking students about ways in which they struggle and ways in which I can support. Conducting research and co-presenting work with students. I often encourage this, and this could just be if students are not comfortable with maybe publishing something, we can still present at those forums. Every year we have like an undergraduate scholar forum, and I'm always encourage students to transform their research into something larger to share with the wider audience. Display vulnerability, yet keep it student-centered. So when I was, I think, a novice instructor, I always thought that I needed to just be perfect in the classroom and maybe show that I'm the one who has the authority. And I quickly learned, this is not showing love to students. So I do often share my, these are some things that I struggle with too, but I do like to keep it student-centered. And that way students see, I am human too, these are some things, challenges that we are dealing with collectively. but I do allow students to lead the charge by determining what action and proactive measures of justice can be taken in the classroom. Understanding that I'm working with students, some students who are not Christians, many students who are not US citizens, right? Students who cannot get past that barrier of, you're still the teacher, I'm still the student, you're still the one grading my paper, right? So this is why it's important that I keep it student-centered, and not try to overimpose or overempower. Having students understand you still have the authority to write your own work and share your own work, and I will not try to dismantle that or not include that into the curriculum. Solidarity building. How am I lifting up others? Devote time to an interfaith dialogue regarding critical topics, an example, partnerships. So places like the US where religion, freedom to practice one's own religion, this is very important because all of our institutions, we have students from many different walks of life. So it's very important that I'm cognizant of who my students are and what they believe in, right? So talking about ways in which we can establish partnerships, peacemaking, talking about some of these concepts and terms that may not go over so well, right? Or maybe there's a lack of understanding or miscommunication of what these terms mean, particularly within your culture versus mine. Set the tone in the course with which there is a community of respect and openness to different beliefs. So we do have like a focus student-run group on campus, and this focus group is like a faith-based group, and it welcomes students from all walks of life. And I am one of the advisors in this group, and we talk about ways in which our faith impacts or influences how we carry ourselves, how we teach, how we learn, how we understand things. But it's all about working collaboratively in the spirit of solidarity, right? So the need for dialogue is important, right? How am I valuing others? Asking students to develop preliminary questions and rules of discussion to be determined prior to the assigned activity, all right? So careful not to impose. I do ask students to develop questions. What are some rules of this discussion? How am I going to go into this discussion being mindful, of how students feel? Debrief and reflect on how the class cultivates students' sense of connection. Administer a survey to gauge students' sentiments of belonging, which is very important. In this current day and age, we're consistently focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, access, belonging, and justice, right? So the need for surveys, whether it's a Microsoft form, Google form, to evaluate what students' sentiments are and what needs changing in order to build solidarity or solidify that solidarity. Now, it's not going to always be perfect, right? Although we strive to have this uniform solidarity across the board, there are some people who are just not on that journey yet or don't have that goal yet, or it's never a perfect classroom. So we do struggle and we do flounder at certain points. But we still have to think as educators, how are we evolving? What can we do to be more inclusive, or maybe work towards bringing in that group of students who may be reluctant to talk about certain topics that are viewed as controversial or inappropriate in their home context. Number 4, attention to borders and boundaries, right? So again, center the voices and experiences of non-US citizens, for example, right? So when we think of borders and boundaries, ways in which we are viewing who's a citizen, who is not a citizen, who is linguistically proficient, who is not. How do we center the voices of students who have been historically marginalized or who are viewed as marginalized within our current context and situation? So how are we sharing these resources, right? So working within the US, then it's incumbent upon me to center the voices of those who are not US citizens, right? So using my privilege or my asset, how I view it, to help others. Survey students' thoughts about assignment tasks by employing the start, stop, start, continue technique. So for example, asking students, what do you think I should stop doing in the classroom? So usually I require students to meet with me each semester, and I do administer points for that. And at our meeting, I kind of start off with this technique. Hi, thank you for coming. We have our small talk, but then I ask, what do you think I should stop doing in the classroom? What is not serving you? What do you think I should start doing in the classroom? How can I better assist you? What do you like that I already do in the classroom? What do you think I should continue to do? Right? And for some students, they haven't had the time to think about it. So they're just like, yeah, it's okay, I like it. And for other students, it's like, oh, I don't know. I don't know about stopping, but I like when you do this. So students tend to home in on the continued technique. And then they do give me some feedback. And I feel like students feel like they have a little bit more control when they do that, because I do try to accommodate the needs of students as much as possible. Another example, providing translation materials and be willing to demonstrate tasks with video tutorials. So I do like when students write in their heritage language, although sometimes, a lot of times I cannot read it. So I teach students who are coming, who are from Ukraine, who are from Morocco, who are from Brazil, who are from Mexico, so many different places, who are from Italy, so many different places. And I love when students incorporate their heritage language into their paper, although I always ask for translation for me so I can understand it, and they present on their work. And it helps me get a better sense of where students are coming from and how they understand the material or US culture. All right. And it's become, I'm laughing because it becomes such a fun class, and we talk about so many different things, and we truly build a sense of community in the classroom. Valuing others, ask students to outline what constitutes as borders and boundaries, and negotiate when or if those borders or boundaries can be questioned to create a more equitable space, right? Because a lot of times there is a lot of ignorance, right? For example, maybe teachers who are from the US assuming that students should know everything about the US culture, or assuming that even US citizens, we should know what's appropriate, what's inappropriate about students who are coming from different cultures. Now, we do, as educators and professors, we do receive training on this, but we fall short many times, right? But we do not say, I fall short, so I need to just quit or whatnot. No, we keep going. We find ways to still reestablish that rapport with students. How can I become better? What did I do wrong, and what should I improve in? Right? How am I evolving? Review and accommodations, for example, required from both the teacher and student and requested by the students, then facilitate change in future assignments and tasks. For example, acknowledging religious holidays and honoring student time off. So actually incorporating this in the syllabus and assessing students' knowledge of the syllabus to see whether they've read it and how they understand what some of the guidelines are within the syllabus. So there are multiple ways in which we can pay attention to borders and boundaries. But I know this can also be a challenge when students are a little bit more reticent and don't want to really open up about what are some of their boundaries. And so it's going to require meeting with students, inviting students to the office, and sometimes making it a requirement by issuing points. And I think that's one step in which we can evolve. So my conclusion, employing a transnational Black feminist lens is useful for English language teachers who are seeking ways to engage in liberation pedagogy, coalition building, foster solidarity, challenge oppressive systems, unpack their own biases and ways of knowing, and engage in scholar activism. In order for it to be effective, in order for a TBF lens to be effectively employed, transparency is a must. Importantly, both love as an idea and love as a method are required as a practice of freedom, of equity, and justice. Teachers must engage in reflective practices to self-assess, but also reflexivity to move forward. Teachers must be constantly asking, how am I lifting up others? How am I offering support? How am I valuing others? And how am I evolving as a person and professional? Because TBF confronts oppressive systems, teachers must also question ways in which their pedagogy is both inclusive or not and anti-racist or not by intentionally recognizing their own biases in the curriculum. I know that I'm just at time, but I did have some discussion questions. If you all want to screenshot or think about it and maybe post those questions in the chat. I'll give you a few minutes to just look at it. These are my references. And this is my contact information. Thank you.
Okay, we want to thank Dr. Quanisha Charles for joining us this morning with her presentation. Some of the key takeaways from Dr. Charles's presentation is to think about yourself from the lens to self-transitional understanding, and also understanding about transnational Black feminism. Be transparent, be clear, know that sometimes the truth hurts, but it helps us to evolve. Make sure that we lift up our voices for what we support, and utilize the start, stop, and what to continue activity to help further discussion and foster authentic conversation with your students and your colleagues in educational and social settings. So thank you so much, Dr. Charles. If there's any questions, you can go ahead and post those in the chat, or you can, of course, state your question. Okay, I'm looking. Keisha Bryan says, wonderful presentation. This work shows how teaching is not only an act of love, but a commitment to humanity. Joy Scantlebury, great presentation. See lots of positive comments. Okay, I see Kai McKenzie, your hand is raised, and James Murray. So Kai first and then Mr. James.
Hi, Quanisha. Thank you so much. This is really inspiring and helpful with so many specific suggestions. I just, I'm trying to imagine classroom situations. You mentioned issues where international students may have home situations where they're uncomfortable or it's inappropriate to discuss specific topics. And I'm wondering what you advise for situations where you have basically like cross-cultural clash around beliefs and values, and how you negotiate those situations when you're being so encouraging for students to really share, their full selves and their faith. And, how do you navigate those possibilities where things can get difficult?
Thank you for your question, Kai. So I put it in my syllabus. I kind of set the tone. Well, I do set the tone at the beginning of the semester. So first day of class, when we were reviewing the syllabus, I tell students up front, these are some topics we're going to be exploring. I let them know that we are a community, a classroom community of respect, where we respect the values and beliefs of everyone. And I do encourage them to come and talk with me one-on-one if they feel like I cannot go through with this classroom or this topic is going to be hard for me. I do allow alternative assignments if students are not so comfortable with engaging with certain topics. I do allow students, maybe, you can remain silent, or you don't necessarily have to engage with this topic, or you can do an alternative assignment to this topic. So I cannot force any students to talk about something that they just really strongly feel impassionate about, or just like really don't want to discuss. But I do encourage students to talk with me one-on-one to find out, where is this harm coming from, or why do you feel the ways in which you do, right? And oftentimes it's because many students have not, these topics have been taboo in their country, it's outlawed. Maybe some traumatic events that happened when someone talked about this topic. So it's a lot of unpacking. And once you get to know students, you start realizing, where is this trauma coming from? And you see how that plays out. But I like to believe that we live in a democracy where we have the freedom and right to talk about these topics that have harmed us for decades and years and centuries. And what can we do to be more forward thinking, right? And so I feel like love is an essential component. How can we help others feel welcomed? How can we talk about this? Or how can I meet one-on-one? So sometimes it does require me meeting with the student one-on-one and maybe having students open up a little bit more to understand how other students may be feeling. I hope I addressed your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Mr. James Murray.
Good morning, Dr. Charles. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I had a question from guiding principle number 1, the V, where you wrote, ask students to share names of famous scholars, writers from their heritage, or who speak their heritage language and incorporate it into the curriculum and assignment. I'm not saying it's an unusual assignment, and maybe many others use it, but I use that often. And this is the first time I've ever seen another instructor of non-native speakers have that specific assignment. I teach at a community college, writing class for non-native speakers of English. The next class will be freshman English for them. This is one of my favorite assignments, obviously, for any instructor would be, because we get this information about their culture elicited. It's interesting to read, but it's very difficult. So students have a really difficult time. I teach a population primarily from East African countries, Eritrea, Ethiopia, West Africa, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and then El Salvador. This question is very difficult. While they can come up with entertainers and politicians, maybe only about 20% of the time are students actually able to identify scholars and writers. And I'm wondering, even among American students, if they would be able to identify scholars or writers coming out of high school. And I'm wondering what success you have had with this assignment. Thanks.
So I do list, and these are only a few items that I've listed, but I give students a large selection to choose from. Students often like to go with what's popular culture. So for example, maybe K-pop, or somebody who is, plastered everywhere, Will Smith, things like that. So sometimes students don't always go to that scholar. Sometimes they go to what's popular because it's a younger generation, right? It's very rare that many students go directly to scholars. The population that I'm teaching right now, it's usually undergraduates, right? So they're still learning how to navigate academic scholarly work, right? So these are some things we learn about. And so I had a student who was from she was from Pakistan, and she struggled with finding a scholar to discuss. And so she couldn't find anyone particularly within the database because it was hard to navigate it, because within her language, the database had such a limited amount of resources for her. So she had to pull something directly from her home context, and that required using a VPN, and it required more other challenges. So she pulled a scholar, but the scholar wouldn't probably be viewed as, the scholarship probably wouldn't be viewed as scholarly content within the US context, because it was like a .com source, but that person was still a scholar. So that goes back into what we view as scholarly authors versus what's viewed as scholarly within her home context. And so that ties the line of borders and boundaries as well. So I am very lenient in letting students share how they view scholarly work and scholarship and what that means. And then maybe even some comparison, and where do we go from here? So it's usually a challenge when it comes to the scholarly content, because a lot of the work within our database is limited in multiple languages, right? Because English is the dominant language, of course. But I do allow students to research a wide range of sources to find what they're looking for and how they can meet the challenge of the assignment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we want to thank Dr. Quanisha Charles for her presentation. Dr. Charles, there is a question statement in the chat. I'm going to ask for you to address it directly to Ms. Sierra Shea Callwood. We are getting ready to move into our next presenter. I'm going to go ahead and call to the floor Dr. Olive Nabukeera. She's coming up next. So, Ms. Nabukeera, you can now present your screen.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? Okay.
Yes.
First of all, I'm so excited to present today. I'm grateful for the opportunity. My name is Olive Nabukeera. Nabukeera is an East African name, a Ugandan name, so it's really difficult to pronounce. But I'm always happy to be called Olive. And my talk today is on how they see us, which is to sort of examine the visible and invisibility dynamic in ESL teaching, and in particular, Black ESL teachers of adult learners. I'd like to introduce myself a little bit because my background sort of informs this talk. I am originally from Uganda. I have an accent because I went to school in England, and so students are always curious about that. But I moved to America about 10 years ago. And when I originally came in to do my doctoral work, I was interested in language and policy and access, especially for East African students. And when I got here, I realized that my identity as a Black person was forefront. It had never been, it's always been other things. Back home in Uganda, tribes are more important than anything else. And so for me, it was sort of interesting to start to see how other people view me or how they see me in comparison to sort of how I view myself, or what sort of I think of myself as a Black person, as a Black woman, and also as a teacher of English. And so when I decided to do my doctoral work, I switched to examine this topic in detail. I'll go through sort of a few things I'll be discussing. Obviously, we cannot talk about visibility without talking about representation. So I'll give a brief overview of what that is, and also the definition of visibility as is I think it should be, rather than what is in sort of what people think it is. I'll go a little bit into the research study that I did that sort of informs the work that I'll be discussing today. I'll give examples of hypervisibility and invisibility when it comes to how Black teachers are perceived, and then a way forward. So I'll start off with the idea of visibility. Usually it's the thinking of where the Black English teachers, in my own experience, I have taught in both language centers as well as in IEP programs in 3 universities. Right now I teach at University of Southern California. But I have had the opportunity to sort of work in 2 different contexts with two different sort of learning needs and students. So in the IEP programs, they're sort of very interested in academic work and trying to get into university or trying to get into the master's programs. While in the language centers, it's more about English for conversation and for communication. And so the needs are different. But what I found to be sort of similar across the board is that usually it was just me as the only Black instructor, or it was just one of 2 or one of 3. So it's always been, we've always been the minority, at least in my observation, of working in these places. And I thought this quote kind of encapsulates the idea of visibility, where on one hand, it is how many Black people are employed, or how many Black instructors are there in terms of numerical representation, but also the idea of what does it really mean to be visible apart from numbers. And so Carby says the Black woman's critique of history has not only involved us coming to terms with absences, we have also been outraged by the ways in which it has made us visible, but also when it has chosen to see us. And this sort of encapsulates my my talk for today, the dynamic between you're there, but you're not there really. So we cannot talk about visibility without talking about representation and what that means. I do not, in my own experience of sort of looking for the literature, I haven't found statistical data that sort of shows how the racial representation in ESL, in particular in the United States, there's a lot of studies on K through 12, but I haven't seen any quantitative data. But we have evidence from the literature that's available and the research that's available. And Jenkins I love this quote because it says, while quantifiable data would reveal the extent to which we have a problem, our eyes do tell us that there is indeed a problem. And so a lot of the qualitative work does sort of say, well, Black faculty are a numerical minority in the States. But we also know that underrepresentation is a global issue. When you read research in Canada, in the UK, in Asia, in Asian countries, we're still underrepresented. And there's luckily a lot more qualitative research studies now. And I also, for my doctoral work, I also added to this sort of issue of trying to analyze and get experiences of the few teachers that are in the field. So when we think of visibility, we're always thinking of numbers, but I feel like it is certainly more than that. It's the ability to control how you're perceived. And we know that as Black professionals, sometimes your race precedes you. They see that first before they see anything else. So our ability to control how we're perceived can be quite iffy depending on where we are, and also whether one is fully recognized and appreciated for their efforts. I believe if those two things, the dynamic between those two things is what informs how we are perceived as English language professionals. So the invisibility paradox is sort of the argument that I'll be presenting is the idea that Black teachers are racially visible. When you walk in, you'll probably see one faculty member who's Black. You will see a few people in there, sprinkles of Black professors or Black instructors. But because of that reason, the visibility creates a hyper visibility, and I'll explain that in a minute. But then you're visible, but it doesn't really come with any real power or any meaning. You're not making any really meaningful contribution. Obviously, I'm generalizing. I'm using my own experience and the experience of my participants from the research to inform this work. And because you don't have any real power, then you are, again, invisible in some way. So Daniel sort of says, Black academics are expected to play the role of a child who is seen but never heard from. So based on this idea, I did a study that aimed to examine how the intersectionality between race and or perceived linguistic minority influences Black ESL teachers' personal and professional identities. I use narrative inquiry because I do believe that we deserve the right to tell our stories. We deserve the right to sort of talk through what our experiences are because they're not represented in the literature. And the context was I found instructors that are in the United States, Black instructors that identify as Black by ethnicity. And the research questions I wanted to examine, one, how do teachers position themselves? How do they understand their role as language instructors? To what extent does the perception of others, of them belonging to a minority race, ethnicity, and language play a role in their professional experiences? And because of those two questions, how is racial and linguistic identity shaped, negotiated, and renegotiated. For this study, I base it in three theoretical ideas. One is positioning theory, and the idea that you have the interactive positioning where people see you, whatever people see you as a Black person or as an English speaker or as an ESL teacher, versus how you see yourself, and the idea of those two identities merging to then form who you are when you walk into the classroom and the work that you do as a Black ESL teacher. And I also grounded my research in racial identity, the racial identity framework that sort of examined, in particular, the African-American sort of view of themselves, whether race is salient, whether it's central to who they are, to what extent is ideology a factor, and of course, critical race theory that undergrounds everything. My participants were 7, 2 males, 5 females. I think that number is sort of typical of ESL, where there's usually more, female teachers. The only requirement was they'd had some ESL teaching experience in the US and abroad, self-identified as Black by ethnicity. I used 2 instruments. I used a questionnaire survey, and I interviewed every participant at least an average of 90 to 160 minutes, so about 2 hours. The participants were from everywhere. I had 4 that were in their 30s, 1 was in her 40s, and then 2 in their 60s. Most of them identified, they did tell me I identify as Black American, with the exception of 1 who is Nigerian, although he's lived in America since he was 6 years old. And again, his identity sort of shifts because of that dynamic. And then I had Talia, who said to me she's Afro-Latina because she's Cuban and Ugandan and has grew up in New York. All of my 5 of my participants had doctoral degrees. This was not a requirement, but it was a pleasant surprise, because I think it informed why, it sort of helps explain why is it that Black teachers are not hired, despite the fact that they're really well qualified. And all of my participants spoke another language, some 2, some 3. Also had multiple years of experience, from Sabrina, who had just 1 year, she just started, to Sherry, who'd been teaching in very, very many different places for a really, really long time. And my participants came from all parts of the United States, some in California, in New York, but they also had overseas experience in Turkey and in Senegal, as well as in Spain. The interview guide sort of went through 3 parts. 1 was a personal self-identity, self-definition of their roles. And then we went into the workplace as social, which was the majority of the talk, the interview. And lastly, we talked about the reflections on career, what lessons have been learned, what things would they, what sort of valuable information would they give to other teachers coming into the profession. Based on that study, a few things came up. So as much as those 7 instructors are visible, they're there, they're working, but it also came up that it's just 1 of them, they're very underrepresented. I want now to talk about the issue of hypervisibility. What is the price for inclusion? Okay, so you're finally in that university or in that program. What does it take? What is the experience of being the only one in those institutions? And this quote by Neiman sort of captures that idea of tokens capture a larger share of awareness due to numerical proportions. So the smaller the proportions, the greater the awareness. So if you're 1 of 5, or if you're just 1, obviously there's a lot of attention that's going to be heaped on you as a professor. So one of the things that instructors are highly visible is the idea of hypersurveillance, meaning there's a tendency to focus on otherness or on what they think is very, very different about you. And one of the things that came up in my study was the idea of linguistic profiling, or one of my participants said, well, he's been told, oh, you sound white. And the idea that people think that there is a certain way that Black people should sound. And so they're really surprised when you speak very differently. And it sort of shows again an element of what do they really think of Black people based on speech or manner of speech or accent and so on. So I asked my participants, have you ever had situations where maybe you were misperceived or misidentified based on how you speak? And 4 said yes, and 3 said no. The 4 that said yes, these were some of their points. They said, well, somebody did tell me you speak so well for someone Black. Someone says, oh, you don't have a Black accent. Craig said, oh, you speak very proper. And Talia did say, students would tell her, you don't sound like other Black people, which again, the implication is that there's one way to speak, and that particular way is very, very specific to Black teachers. And so if you don't fit within that category, somehow you're an anomaly, you're different, and that is then becomes the focus of you as a person. For the people that didn't, that said they didn't have any issues, I thought it was interesting, their responses. So Francine said, I would say no, because I'm very conscious of how I speak. I code switch. I speak as I should, or excuse me, as they would want me to. Not as I should. As I should is as I please. But what they want, a part of me, that's my way of keeping a professional persona, because I really don't want them to see me. And again, you can see the conflict between sort of trying a work identity that is, there's a way that to do things, and then there's me, and sort of trying to negotiate that in order to be seen as one way and not another way, because we understand that people have a perception of Black speech. Akuna also said something that I found really interesting, which is, I have a certain level of respect that I command in the environments I work in. I found it interesting, the use of the word respect, because we hadn't spoken about it, but again, in his mind, he sort of said, well, you need to really be very careful how you speak, because they'll perceive you as being disrespectful because you have what is perceived as a Black accent. The other way, of course, after being perceived to speak a different way, the other way is through diversity tokens, or being thought of as a representative of Black issues. I've had this question a lot from students, say, teacher, why are Black people like ... Or teacher, why do Black people do ... And I do tell them I'm not a representative of Black people. I don't know, because again, it's the idea that you sort of are a symbol, you represent everybody. And unfortunately, that's part of, at least in my participants' case, part of the experience of being the only one in these professions. So usually you're either one of each, or you are considered the race expert. You know exactly things to do with Black issues because you're the only Black instructor. So in my study, all of them, I asked them, how many Black people in your department, how many Black instructors? Everybody said they were the only one, with the exception of Talia, who was one of 3. But the other 2 were not instructors, were working in human resource. So these are some of the things that teachers said. Talia said there are 3 of us on staff who are Black. I'm the 3rd, and I was recently hired. I know I was a diversity hire. I know this for a fact. I was told this. Francine said, I interviewed for a teaching position, but when I got the job and became fairly good with the secretary, she said, you know, you got the job because you're Black. I mean, a part of me wants to say, I don't care. I need a job. If Black plays to my advantage, so be it. If this is what you have to do to show diversity, then so be it. Put my name in the bucket. So she's sort of saying, well, I know that I got the job because I'm Black, but that's fine. I'll play to my advantage. Craig was interesting because he said the university was undergoing accreditation and they had to show how diverse they were, not just students, but among faculty. So the school immediately turned to me and said, oh, he's a person who sets a mark. He's a person who represents the minority community, and he's the star. I've only been there for a year, but they had me on television. And lastly, Talia also said, my brother is also a teacher, and someone told him, you're lucky to be here as a Black man. So again, you sort of are tokenized because you're the only one, and made to do activities like in Craig's case, or made to, or informed that you were hired, not because of your qualifications or academic skills or expertise, but because you represent an aspect of diversity that is needed for universities. Because of the racial tokenization, then you are pigeonholed. You're sort of put in a little box and made to feel like you have to do certain things. So the idea of walking into classrooms, I've had this experience where I walk in with books and go to the front of a classroom, and students in the first day of class will ask, teacher, are you the English teacher? And I'm always really surprised because I am standing at the front of the class. So what do you mean? I'm of course I'm the English teacher. But there is a perception of what a professor should look like or be like, and so you always find those questions and they're putting you in a little box, and sometimes it is people are curious about you, sometimes it's overestimating similarities, or we're all the same, there's not, I don't see color, for lack of a better word, or exaggerating differences. Oh my God, your hair is really different from mine. So things like that make you feel like you're being put in a box and being labeled. So I did ask my participants, have you ever had any misperceptions about culture or ethnic background? And most of them said yes. They said, usually students, they don't think I'm Black. They don't automatically go Black first. They think I'm Arab. Craig said he's light skinned, so they think he has white in his family. And Talia, who's biracial, said her students sort of asked, are you one of them? Are you a Latina, or are you one of us? Are you one of them, meaning Black, or are you one of us, meaning Latina? So all of them seem to sort of say we're not thought of as being what we identify as, but different. And then 2 participants said they've not had those experiences. The last part when it comes to hypervisibility is infantilization, and that is the idea of either being thought to be overqualified, which I used to think was a compliment. It's not, when people say, oh, we would like to hire you, but you're overqualified, or incompetent. So teachers sort of said either they've been treated differently, or they felt that their authority was challenged and leadership undermined, or being felt like you're passed over for less credentialed, less experienced colleagues, underappreciated at work, presumed incompetence, being singled out for no reason, and being deliberately unacknowledged or ignored. Some of the examples were Sherry, who said there was a Black female teacher I hired for an evening class, and some students complained about her. So I decided to sit in and observe her class, and she was teaching fine. But it was just a few students who didn't like her, didn't like the way she looked, which I have highlighted that part for a particular reason. And then Sherry said, I got an anonymous email from a female saying, how dare you call yourself a full professor? Sherry at that time was a professor, but somebody thought to question her credentials by sending an anonymous email. Khadija said, they assume I'm very lenient and not as strict with students. And lastly, which I thought was really interesting, Talia said she interviewed for a job as a coordinator. I was the only teacher who had a master's degree in education, who was a teacher by trade, had been there for maybe 8 or 9 months and had 15 years of teaching experience. I was also trilingual and had worked abroad. I didn't get the job, the promotion, and I was told you did not look like an IB coordinator. I was going up against a reporter and someone with an associate's degree and someone with a political science degree. So again, you sort of get the feeling that you're put in a box, you're pigeonholed, and then unfortunately you might miss out on opportunities because of the perception of what Blackness means. And because you're hypervisible, then it creates a situation where you're an insider, outsider. You're in the system, but you're really not there. So Simon says, the world I inhabit as an academic is a white world. I'm a freshwater fish that swims in seawater. I feel the weight of the water on my body. The experience of invisibility is quite difficult. I have personally experienced it, of knowing that you're in the system, but there's also a sense that you really are not in the system. So two ways that at university or in IP programs, invisibility occurs for teachers who are Black and are also the only one. They are underrepresented. There's a culture of exclusion, and exclusion being divided into two parts. So professional exclusion, where Puar calls it space invaders, or, you know, being made to feel like you're not supposed to be there. The double take when you walk in and people look at you again and sort of wonder, are you a student? Are you the professor? What are you? And so Akuna said, I have great co-workers. I get along with them, we connect, but sometimes I feel like I'm on an island. I'm just here in a sea of white. And then there's social exclusion, which, I mean, our first job is to be teachers. So professional isolation might be part of the job, but there's also the other aspect of social activities. Settle says, for example, lunch, where people got to lunch and then you realize everybody's friends or everybody went to lunch and nobody invited you, and sort of equated it to the golf course in academia, a special club that everybody else gets to go to. And so Sabrina says, the amount of disrespect that I get from the administration and other teachers in terms of like leaving me out of conversations or emails. No one texts me. They don't include me in things. Or Talia, who said, I have been left out of team bonding activities. So these experiences of being professionally isolated and socially isolated as well can produce psychosocial consequences, loneliness, frustration, and then of course, just leaving the job altogether. The second part of being invisible has to do with epistemic exclusion, which is something that's been widely published, being regarded as a race researcher, which then affects publishing because specialized journals are not considered mainstream sometimes, and this then affects tenureship and promotion. But also a very new article that I really loved is the idea of gatekeeping at ELT conferences, where particular people are invited and maybe there's not any Black speakers who are on the panels or who are giving the plenary and so on. And so Talia said, look at the presenters that we have at TISO conferences. There are very few Black presenters. They're all Arabs or white Americans. And so her sort of critique was, what's TISO Africa doing to change that? The other one where we are invisible is in the materials. So no Black language learners, no Black teachers, no diverse Englishers in the textbooks. Efforts obviously are being made, but there's still a lack there. And so what is our responsibility as Black teachers? I asked this question to my participants, and the answer seemed to be to decentralize yourself. And to decentralize meaning that as much as, for example, almost all of my participants were Americans, what I found is that most of them had made a deliberate effort to incorporate instructional material that is not mainstream. So textbooks by non-white, non-American authors, and they were very intentional about facilitating open dialogue on race and other topics that maybe other teachers would have thought of as controversial. So Talia said she made her students read books by authors who were Latino and Black American, and no one who worked with ESL students understood why she needed to do it. Francine said she would like to find materials written by other people, but it's really difficult to find them, especially those that are deemed academic and given worthy presence. And lastly, Craig said, as an African-American teacher, students need to know that there's more to America than St. Patrick's Day or Columbus Day. So the thing that I really found interesting was, again, the idea that it's not just about America, because I think sometimes, and I think the previous speaker said this, I think Dr. Charles mentioned this a bit, the idea that teachers have to get out of the way when it comes to centralizing your own culture as the standard, and sort of reminding students that their cultures are significant as well, and bringing those cultures in the classroom. So lastly, what can we do, or what were some of the suggestions for teachers to be strategically visible? So obviously, depending on your level of investment in the organization, people are able to challenge the status quo, and whether it be through making your voice heard. For example, Sherry was on a last hiring committee, and she was the only Black person on that committee to hire, and they usually tend to hire white women. And she said, I've recently been bringing that up to people's attention, the idea of let's hire more Black professionals. And so that's the way that she's contributing to hoping that things change. Craig said when they asked him to be the diversity representative, he says, when there's an opportunity for me, it propelled me to a position that I wouldn't have had, but I'd been waiting for. Because as an African-American, Black History Month is about my heritage, my culture, but my culture teaches me to be inclusive, not exclusive. So in this way, you sort of are deciding to play the game and challenge the system a little bit, but again, depending on your level of investment. The second strategy is to be strategically invisible, which most of my participants said is what they do. You pick your battles, you do your best work, and you try as much as possible to detach and not get too much involved in your role as the Black person, not to center your racial identity as very, very significant to what you're there to do. So for example, Sherry said, I do believe in picking your battles. My job is a means to an end. It's not my all. While Akuna said, sometimes I just listen and smile and wonder, how much brain power and energy do I have to deal with this? Is it that bad? Is it bad enough? So I don't feel like I have a responsibility to speak up all the time. So even in this way, it sort of depends. Most of them said to me, I don't get involved. I try and do my work and go home. But then that is also a form of resistance. And lastly is what BU, which is the idea of the third space, that's in social cultural theory as well, where we have home, we have work, and then there's another space where Black teachers meet. One of the things that most of my participants said to me was, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. I have all these things that I think about, but we don't have the opportunity to. When being the only one, you don't get to meet with other Black professionals, and we don't see each other a lot in conferences and other spaces. So it's necessary to have a third space, a place where we do things like this, which is conventions and sort of things to highlight our issues and to sort of share ideas and how to get along and so on. My conclusion is there is definitely a need to examine the culture of exclusion. It is there. It's not talked about, but it is there, where you feel like you're in there, but you're not really. I think the question now is allyship has to be less performative and more actionable. I think what happened is after 2020, I personally thought there would be a shift in the way that representation is looked at, in the way that Black faculty diversity is looked at, but it is still, people think anti-racist work is more than avoiding, is talking about, racist language, but it is more than that. And the third thing, it's very, very important to have Black teacher support and spaces. So the limitations, or my recommendations, would be the need for quantitative studies on racial underrepresentation in ESL. There does need to be a comparative study on Black teachers and TESOL all over the world, and studies on unconscious biases, particularly in ESL teaching, but also the experience of other Black teachers, for example, non-native English-speaking teachers working in America, or Black immigrant teachers as well, because their experience of Blackness, of identity, are very, very different from, for example, the African-American experience. These are my references, and that is my contact information. Thank you very much again for this talk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Hello. So thank you so much, Dr. Olivia Nabukeera, for that wonderful presentation. Just some key points that we want to highlight. Is to encourage visibility of our students and colleagues, and especially ourselves, learning how to lean into how we are perceived so that we know how to protect ourselves, and to not center on our racial identity, but just learning to be us amongst all of the chaos. Recognize and address cultural assumptions, help our students to understand that as well, and practice strategic invisibility. You can practice it, but not to a fault, so that it helps, I guess, to release some of our stress that we go through from day to day. So I hope I highlighted some key points that were relevant to your talk. Thank you
Yes.
so much.